very much. I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Chairman. My name is Brian Helmick. I'm a public and project finance attorney with Spillman Thomas Sabato here in Charleston, also chair of the firm's corporate department. In my practice, on a daily basis, I get a lot involved in project financings, public infrastructure projects, which obviously in today's world leads a lot of state and local tax issues as well. I've been asked to speak to you this morning about tax increment financing. There are two components of tax increment financing in West Virginia: real estate TIFs, as we'll call them, and sales tax TIFs. Starting with the real estate TIF, and I do not have PowerPoints or handouts, but would ask that kind of keep this, for your all sake, if you want, feel free to interrupt me at any point with any questions that you may have. It's a topic that is not readily known or taught about, so I'd be happy to answer any questions at any point. There are currently, to my knowledge, 49 states and the District of Columbia who have some form of real estate tax increment financing options available. The only state that does not currently, to my knowledge, is the state of Arizona. In West Virginia, tax increment financing was attempted back in the late 1990s, was found to be unconstitutional. So in 2002, then Governor Wise proposed legislation that established tax increment financing options in West Virginia. That went on the ballot on a statewide constitutional amendment that was adopted. So real estate TIFs are constitutionally approved by the voters in West Virginia, were in 2002. The statute has had a couple of revisions since then, in 2003 or 2004, and recently in 2013. Some cleanup or changes to the statute, but fundamentally, real estate TIFs, as the original act in 2002 was put in place, is still there. We were one of the last states out of that list of 49 in the District of Columbia. We were one of the very last ones on that list to actually implement tax increment financing in West Virginia. Real estate TIFs, for the most part, to explain it kind of in the layman's terms, is each county and Class 1 and Class 2 municipalities in West Virginia have the ability to propose tax increment financing districts. In essence, what that involves is an application process, but it starts with identifying and designating a very specific geographic boundary. So you actually, in a particular county or municipality, would designate and propose a district that is made up of exact certain parcels, tax parcels within that. So it could be, but it is not an entire municipality or an entire county, but is a very discrete proposed district that is established. How it works is that once that district is, and I'll go through the process of approval in a minute, but once that district is established by order of a county commission or ordinance of a municipality, it in essence freezes the tax base on revenues to the local levying bodies as of the July 1st assessment date prior to the calendar year in which it is established. So if a tax increment financing district is established in, say, 2015, you go back to the July 1, 2014 calendar year and look at the July 1, 2014 assessment as the base. Going forward for the entirety of the district, and real estate TIF districts in West Virginia can be in place for up to 30 years. County commissioners and municipalities can establish them for shorter periods, but 30 years is the maximum limit that they can go out. But for that 30-year period, using that as the example, that base that's established as that July 1 day is the base of the tax revenues as they are collected by the sheriff of each county that are remitted back to the local levying bodies and distributed as they always had been. The real estate TIF, and by nature of its name, tax increment financing, it captures the incremental property taxes, both generated from new projects within the district or any organic growth that you may have in the property taxes within that district going forward for the next 30 years. It allows those to be separately segregated into a special fund held at the local level, a real estate TIF fund, where those revenues can then be used for pay-as-you-go projects or to help pay debt service on bond financings that are used to put in larger upfront projects. So it is a financing mechanism for local, now public infrastructure projects. As I said, it's been in place since 2002. As we move forward, there are a number of districts now around the state, and what we've seen is an evolution of the program. The statute as it's in place now is very broad. It allows for a lot of uses of tax increment financing, bond financing, and pay-as-you-go for projects, both public and private. Initially, out of the chute, there were a couple of, quote, private projects that were funded using tax increment financing bonds. Under the Manchin administration in 2005, policy of the governor's staff was to redirect that and to make sure that TIF revenues, since they were an imposition on local and state taxes, that they be directed towards public infrastructure projects. So there are projects that encourage private investment and realize improvements off of those, but that the revenues themselves be spent on projects that are public infrastructure projects, primarily roads, water, and sewage. That would help open up certain areas within those TIF districts. Again, very distinct boundaries to help in public infrastructure, which is a way to help strengthen the local tax base by encouraging additional private investment in those districts. As I mentioned, it's been in place now since 2002. Each year, every county or municipality that has a TIF district is required to file an annual report with the State Development Office. As of December 31st of 2014, and I'm not aware of any since then, there were had been a total of 32 real estate TIF districts created in West Virginia. There are 31 still in existence. One was originally put in place by the Harrison County Commission for the Pete Dye Golf Course project. That TIF district has since been terminated and dissolved. So there are still today 31 active real estate TIF districts in the state. Those TIF districts are located in 14 different counties. So over 25% of the state's counties now have at least one TIF district located in them. Not all of those TIF districts are created by counties. Actually, 17 of the existing TIF districts are county commission TIF districts, and 14 of those are municipal TIF districts. Again, Class 1 or Class 2 municipalities. There are a handful of counties in which only have one TIF district. There are a couple that stand out. Currently, Harrison County, between Clarksburg and Bridgeport, have a total of 4 real estate TIF districts. Ohio County has a total of 4 in place, and Montague County is the largest with a total of 8 within the county itself. And what we've seen in those, that some of those county commissions, again, are actually TIF districts that were issued on behalf of a Class 2 or a Class 3 or 4 municipality that under the current law does not have any authority to establish their own. So they in essence serve as a conduit for those TIF districts, for those smaller municipalities. Those projects run the gamut, but for the most part you're going to see that they are all based on water and sewage infrastructure extension and expansion opportunities and road improvements that have allowed for the development of brownfield areas or the development of some cases greenfield areas for private businesses to make investment. I would say off the top that one of the aspects of this is really focuses on where do you make investments to get a return on investment. Not every expenditure, in my opinion, not every expenditure that government makes is just an expenditure out the door. In many cases, they are investments on strengthening and building a larger tax base. And in a particular case, that's what real estate TIFs do. It's a way to finance public infrastructure to grow the tax base and use the tax base growth in order to pay for the infrastructure. In my public project financing practice, municipalities and counties, PSDs, are rather limited in the way that they can finance projects. And from a state funding perspective, to be able to build out a public infrastructure or water sewage project for future expansion is almost an impossibility because it's based off of ratepayers. So as you're based on current financing through the infrastructure and those funding mechanisms, you're really based off of what ratepayers are in place already or we know are going to be there immediately so that they can pay the rates that allow us to pay the debt service to build those projects. So the ability to build out, if you will, speculative public infrastructure is extremely limited at the local level. This was a tool that put in place allowed the locals, county commissions and municipalities, the ability to play a greater hand, if you will, probably an early version of a home rule program, have a hand in actually selecting what areas of their counties or municipalities should be ripe for that type of investment, and then finding another financing mechanism to help make those investments to build out that infrastructure. These TIF districts, we talk about private investment, only work if you have private investment. If a TIF district is created and there is no private investment that generates capital investments in either personal or real property, there are no tax increments created, therefore the TIF district will never succeed because there is no increment to pay for projects or to pay for debt service on projects. So a fundamental basis of these projects and these districts is that they are created knowing that substantial public investment is being made or will be made in those districts. The common rule of thumb amongst the professionals that do TIF districts today is that for every $10 million of private capital investment made into a TIF district, that will generate approximately $1 million of available TIF funds. So if you're looking at a project in a particular TIF district or in a particular county that would be, say, a $5 million public infrastructure need, water, road, sewage build-outs, sewage capacity improvements, you have to know that you've got $50 million worth of private investment coming into that district to generate that. So it is if it doesn't come, it doesn't materialize. It is not a speculation that you in essence get debt out there that will not be repaid. You are certain in the financing markets going to have to know that those project investments will be made or the debt will not be issued. That's just a fundamental basis of how the debt markets work. What we have seen in most TIF districts is that private developers step forward with proposals. There have been proposals made by the counties or municipalities themselves, but for the most part we see private developers come in and propose the creation of the TIF district and the project plan, so as we know what to be built out to incentivize those projects they're working on. But in that capacity, because it takes 2 or 3 years with the way that we tax, and I know you're going to hear more about that this morning, how we assess and then levy taxes, that there's always an 18 to 24 month carry forward before we start seeing realization of tax revenues after investments are made. So therefore, in the first couple of years of the life of a TIF district, the financings are very speculative. And in that nature, what they tend to be are developer reimbursement models, meaning that the developer themselves comes in and finances the acquisition of the bonds to create the revenues to put the infrastructure in. And the developers assume the risk that those private investments will be made and that they will get paid back. If those investments are never made and the developer has purchased those bonds, all of the risk is put onto the developer. TIF districts, both for municipalities and county commissions, are special tax implications, and they are special revenue sources. So they are not held against the local levying bodies for purposes of their rating for general obligation purposes. So if they do not materialize, the risk is on the developer or the bond purchasers, not on the county commissions or municipalities. Now, we all know no county commission or municipality wants to have even a footnote in their audit that says that bonds are in default. So the county commissions and municipalities, in my experience, have been very diligent in understanding how this works and that they're comfortable in what's being proposed. And for the most part, want those commitments that these projects are there, are going to be, investments are being made or will be made very quickly before they step into the arena to issue debt on them. So it has been a very conservative model going forward, developer-driven with risk, but it has been very successful. As I say, you look around the state, there are many TIF districts that have actually proven themselves out very well. Not getting into those details today, but again, as I said, there are, at this time, 31 TIF districts in 14 counties. Most people don't realize they exist. One of the things of the process and the approval process that's involved does involve an application. So it is required that you, in essence, put in there exactly what the TIF boundaries will be, what the project plan that you're proposing, where will you spend the monies. That is part of the application. That is required to be of record in the county clerk's office or the city clerk's office during the notice publication of a Class 2 legal notice that goes into the paper so that all the citizens are aware that this is being proposed. There is a requirement in the code today, which is a good thing, of a public hearing to allow anybody who wants to come and speak for or against TIF districts. And having sat through those hearings, I can tell you there are a lot of people who come and speak to both. It's one of the areas where most public hearings at the local level, you see very little public involvement. This has been one area that has generated interest and involvement. But they have, as they move forward through the process, once the county commission or the municipality is comfortable with that, those are then sent, those applications are not approved then, but they are submitted to the State Development Office. It is the director of the State Development Office who, under state law, has the authority to approve or disapprove real estate TIF districts. So there is no TIF district anywhere created in the state that has not received the approval of the State Development Office. Again, I will give kudos to their office and have now since the inception of the program. They are diligent in reviewing applications. They get involved early in the process to make sure that they see the benefit. Many of the projects involve projects that they themselves are involved with recruiting to the area or to the state. And they just don't simply just rubber stamp applications, but do get actively involved in the 60-day period that they have to review them to make sure that they believe that they're sound, that they're good investments, and that they're good for the state and not just the local community. The implication of having the state involved in it, there's a couple reasons, but as part of the original statute that was put in place in 2002, is a provision, and this is where it comes back to the state aspect of financial involvement. Although they are created in their local TIF districts, and they're not developer-controlled districts, but they are districts of the county commission and municipality. The local governments control them once they are established. But there is a provision in the state code that provides that any monies that are collected into a TIF district, into the TIF fund, the increment that's created, is not included in the state's local share calculation for purposes of determining local share for budget purposes. So in essence, what ends up happening is that for whatever is created, the increment that's created in these TIF districts, while it is not affecting your base budget, because the base budget is based off of the assessments that were already in place, which are frozen and are still collected and go to the levying bodies and is in the state school aid formula. The increment going forward is not. So in essence, it's not a cut on the base budget for the state, but it is an opportunity cost that the state participates in by agreeing to allow the locals to capture these into the TIF fund, knowing that when you do so, that what would have been otherwise created had the TIF district not been there may have going into the local share for the county share, which would have potentially reduced the state's participation to that county through the school aid formula. So therefore, there is an opportunity cost that directly relates back to the state budget in those projects. Typically what we see, depending if it's in the county or in the city, and I know the tax and revenue folks know this better than I, but typically we average somewhere around 70 to 75% of all local revenues, property tax revenues, do go to the school board. So in that case, the state does have a vested financial interest in real estate TIF districts. Nonetheless, they are an investment. They have proved very fruitful. And in many parts of the state where they've been put in place, we've seen the growth that has grown out of them. There is a but-for test in the real estate TIF district that but for the use of the TIF financing, you would not be making this investment. And that is a finding that's made at the local level and obviously is reviewed by the State Development Office. But again, that is the incremental component that picks up TIFs that make them investments in that process. As I said, the statute is still very broad, but it has been very narrow to, at this point, to public infrastructure projects. They have expanded throughout the state, and for the most part, they are, because of our property tax base already, they are much smaller in nature than what most people may realize. Most real estate TIF projects on an expenditure basis, you will find will be somewhere between $1 million and upwards of maybe $5 to $10 million. So while they are infrastructure projects, they go do not go very far at all when it comes to talking about major infrastructure builds today. Just a mile of road could well exceed what a real estate TIF district could actually generate. So for the most part, they are water and sewage expansion projects in that process. They come with some requirements when you put them in place because they are an expenditure of public funds. They are required to comply just as at the state level would be with competitive bidding statutes, with local labor act provisions, and with whatever the current prevailing wage statute may be. So they do come with those requirements and must comply with those, which is in essence and to some extent lend themselves to be tagged at times as public-private because we have private investments, many times private developers carrying out the projects, but they do so as an agent for and under the guises as what you typically would find from a public infrastructure project. For the most part, I know we've got limited time to cover 3 topics today. That is kind of the basic underlying basis for real estate TIF districts, how they play out, how they impact potentially the state budget on the school aid formula each year as well. In addition to real estate TIF districts, the state also authorizes the imposition or creation of sales tax TIF districts. Fundamentally, they are nearly identical to real estate TIF districts in this capacity that they are proposed by locals, municipalities, or county commissions. They are discrete geographic boundaries. Two main differences are that they capture the incremental growth of sales taxes within the district rather than property taxes, and that they require more than just development office approval of the state, but they require actually to be put into state law. So it requires an act of the state legislature to create a sales tax TIF district in West Virginia. Currently, there are only 3 sales tax TIF districts in West Virginia. That would be the Fort Henry district in Ohio County, known as the Cabela's Project. That's where the program in West Virginia initially started. For a little bit of history on that, what happened was that the Cabela's came looking for sites along the East Coast. The State Development Office engaged in conversations with them. So did the Ohio County Development Authority. Part of that project was, a lot of people see the storefront that may be out by the interstate where sales tax increment financing was utilized. But the impetus behind that project, for the most part, was the distribution facility that's located on the backside of the property. But the nature of that project is that district itself is both a real estate TIF district and a sales tax TIF district. So both TIF districts coexist there, which is permitted by statute. So they can overlay each other, and all three sales tax districts do that. They all three are in conjunction with real estate TIF districts. But that was brought here because the Cabela's folks had used that financing tool for their project actually in Kansas City a few years before, and they brought that to the table. It was actually put in state code by virtue of the request of Cabela's and the State Development Office to help make that project happen, which at the time, the Executive Director of the Development Office would tell you that it was about the distribution facility and not about the retail store. But the legislature at that time acquiesced, ran that legislation through to create the TIF district, which did make that project and all that comes out of that today a reality. The state is very narrow in the northern panhandle, but there was a lot of discussion at the time that it was impossible to buy a pair of men's underwear in Ohio County. You had to go into Ohio or over into Pennsylvania to shop retail. That is not the case in Ohio County any longer. The investment of those two TIF districts has created one of the state's largest real estate, largest sales tax districts in the state, one of the largest retail districts, and from that perspective, an overwhelming success in what they were trying to generate. They achieved that goal. The other two sales tax TIF districts that currently exist are more recent. One is at the Charles Point development in Bridgeport. The third is the University Town Center project in Mon County, which actually encompasses part of Mon County and is also located in two municipalities, in Westover and in Granville. That TIF district, as you all may have been well aware, since that's been just in the last couple of years, was primarily to finance the construction of a new baseball stadium for Western University and the minor league baseball team, as well as the interchange, which was the impetus of the project, was to build a new interchange off of Interstate 79 in between Westover and Star City, which is actually under construction and is slated to be completed in June of 2016. But bringing those together in Mon County as an example, to use that as an example of how it's used there, you were using the sales tax TIF increment that's created off of that district to build out the public infrastructure. In this case, the interchange, the roads, and water and sewage, primarily to build out the west-hand side of Mon County. When you get to the east-hand side of Interstate 79, that is very well developed. Now, for the most part, any development is redevelopment or rehabbing of existing facilities or property. But the west-hand side that leads more towards out towards other counties, including Marshall, Ohio County, is the underdeveloped area of the county. This would allow for the infrastructure to be built out to that side to expand that. Since that was created just a couple of years ago, the Development Office currently has another project plan application for the same TIF district on its desk now, awaiting approval, that will allow for the build-out of additional roads and water and sewage capacity. Again, it's nearly impossible to finance those based on speculation or without the projects in hand already. But in that particular case, there are 3 projects which have not been announced yet that are in hand that are waiting approval to build out those roads. So we've seen the exact result of additional development, private investment, coming into those TIF districts by virtue of building out the public infrastructure. The sales tax, because it does have, again, it's an opportunity cost, because they require, under the same as real estate TIFs, the bases are treated the exact same. So you actually take, when the sales tax TIF district is proposed, you do a 12-month look back in that district, whatever that geographic discrete district is, and you do it, the tax department does an analysis of the past 12 months of sales tax collections. Those collections are then captured, and that becomes your base going forward. So the state still receives all of those sales taxes that were previously collected, come right back into the state's general revenue fund. It's the incremental, it's the growth. Again, new projects, new retail sales, organic growth of the existing retailers that is captured in the increment that is then used to finance these public infrastructure projects, either pay-as-you-go or for taxable or tax-exempt bond financings. So it's that future opportunity cost, in essence, that you're giving up as a state to incentivize those. But that is a choice of the legislature. Again, the Development Office has a say in it. They play an active, very active role in designing those districts and being involved in the approval process. But ultimately, there are no sales tax TIF districts created without an affirmative vote of the state legislature, both the House and the Senate and the governor signing it into law, or if not being overrode, perhaps. But so there is a direct involvement there. That is a tool that has been, as we say, much less used than the real estate TIF districts, primarily because of that large imposition. In order to be considered for a sales tax TIF district in the state, also in state code, you all build in provisions, minimum requirements that require a certain amount of capital investment be spent in the district in excess of $75 million within 18 months of the creation of the district, or you don't even qualify to propose a TIF district. So they are kept in, if you will, in the back pocket of the state for larger projects in which there may be a necessity to play to make these happen, but just aren't out there being proposed day in and day out. These are the only ones that have been, for the most part, ever truly proposed and brought to the state. So they are a very limited resource in that tool. But nonetheless, again, they go back to that proposition of being able to allow local communities, county commissions, and municipalities the ability to look at economic development from the larger perspective, look at what the impediments are to economic development in their areas, and for the most part, where that becomes an impediment because of infrastructure needs, road or water, sewage, to build out sites, that leads to the ability for those projects to be funded through an alternative financing mechanism that otherwise would not be available to them and had not been available to them prior to 2002 when this was put in place and voted on by the people in the constitutional amendment. And I say that and hit on the economic development side. From the economic development perspective, and I've served as a short while under then Governor Manchin's administration in the Department of Commerce and the Development Office. When we talk about taxes, and this will lead into the last point that I've got this morning, which is payment in lieu of taxes. One of the larger impositions that we've seen in over years was, just to be blunt, workers' comp was a major detraction. Many site consultants did not put West Virginia even on the list for projects because of our workers' comp environment. That has been solved. And we've heard that from site consultants. That's been solved. That's no longer an impediment to bringing us on. But some of the impediments that we see, for the most part, are going to relate to sites. Do we have actual ample sites that are available? And do we have a workforce that can actually fill those jobs? It's unfortunate to say, but many places in the state, we don't have either in a sufficient capacity today to land projects of more than 50 to 100 jobs. We are very site limited. And we, in many cases, have a gap in the skills gap on the workers for what the companies are looking for, but what we have on the table to provide at that time. There are many educational training programs that are trying to fill that gap, but from the capacity of what TIF districts do in that big picture, it allows for, at least on the one component, on the site development side, it allows a mechanism for the state and locals to work together to develop those sites so that we have sites available to be able to show companies. Many capacities and many times what we see are companies that aren't just looking to locate somewhere and they've got a 5 or 10 year time horizon that allows us to put things in and build out sites over time. Many times they're looking for sites that are already build ready or can be moved to that proposition in 12 to 18 months. Because of the limitations on the approval of sales tax TIF districts, they don't lend themselves to those type of projects anyway. Because in many capacities, we're looking at industrial manufacturing facilities, they don't generate sales taxes. But on the real estate side, it is a tremendous tool to be able to allow locals working with the state to go in, identify a site, and build out the infrastructure necessary to have those pads ready for companies to locate there when they're ready to move in that very short time horizon. But again, I think it goes back from an investment standpoint, as I said before, not every expenditure is just a dollar out the door, but is a return on investment. And in many of these cases, you will see the growth. And you use one example, a client of mine, but the White Oaks Business Park in Bridgeport. When you go up and see the investment that's been made from having a real estate TIF district in place that helped build out the roads and water sewage into that speculative business park, has now generated a project that has over 2,500 people daily traveling into that park to work. It has been a business, creation of a business hub. And the rest of Harrison County will tell you that they are seeing that. They're competing with projects that otherwise in the gas industry would have looked at South Point in Pennsylvania. But because we had those sites available, we had people willing to invest in the buildings, they were able to locate there. So we've seen the successes of these. That project now is very quickly moving to finish that TIF project, which is to extend White Oaks Boulevard over to the next interchange, which will open up an entire thoroughfare, which will also feed as a secondary access to the brand new hospital that was built in Bridgeport. But now we're seeing those jobs. So again, the creation in that project, original TIF was $14 million. So a $14 million investment of future real estate incremental taxes generated a project that is now has 2,500 people daily calling that their home base for their work. So these can work. Again, they're not to be done lightly, and in many cases not on speculation, but where they work, they are great investments and are great, in my opinion, a great use of local and state tax dollars. I say that because to lead into the last point that I have today related to payment in lieu of taxes or pilot agreements. One of the aspects in West Virginia and one of the purposes and reasons that was sold in putting tax increment financing in place was the ability to be able to capture real estate taxes being paid off of projects to help put the investment back into those projects. What we found in reality and experience was that many of the larger projects did not want to utilize real estate TIFs to make that happen, but wanted to do the program that the state has used successfully for years, which is payment in lieu of taxes. And the payment in lieu of tax structure is a simple mechanism that allows locals, in some cases working with the state, but allows local governmental entities to provide for a legal means to provide property tax abatements. It's hard to find, and I know there's some other tax professionals here today that do these as well, it's hard to find a substantial material economic development project, manufacturing industrial, in the last 20 years that has not benefited in some form or fashion from a payment in lieu of tax program. The reason being is many of our surrounding states, and I go to the cost of business. There was a report that's just out this morning. It popped up on mine from CNBC talking about ranking the 50 states. Unfortunately, we show up at 49th on that list. But when you look at the list, you'll find that the cost of doing business, we're ranked 7th in the country. So the general tax propositions that I typically see from my clients, businesses wanting to locate in West Virginia, by reducing the corporate net income tax that we did, eliminated a lot of tax credits back in the early 2000s, reduced those corporate tax rates, or eliminated business franchise, fixed workers' comp, were all tremendous improvements in creating the business environment in West Virginia. If you look at that today, one of the other capacities that we fell in, one was technology and innovation, which can go back to education. The other one was the gap in our skills, our workforce skills, to the jobs that are required. So from that perspective, what's dragging us down to the 49th at this point is not the cost of doing business, but are those capacities which are investments in education and job skills of our people. And on the flip side of that, quite frankly too, was that that study found that regulation was an imposition in doing business in West Virginia. That it was much harder to do business here because of the regulatory environment than it was in other states. But where we still do find tax as being an implication in development and location of projects in West Virginia do fall on the property tax side. And again, rather than using real estate TIF districts, what we have found is, for the most part, they are looking at payment in lieu of taxes. In Ohio, as an example, when you're competing for projects up and down the Ohio River, and right now if you're competing with projects, as an example, in the gas-fired power plant industry in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, the taxing structures of Ohio and Pennsylvania make it much more favorable for those plants to be located in other states than they do in West Virginia. From a property tax perspective, the property tax base in Pennsylvania, the way they treat those, and they can do so under their constitution, is a very minimal tax imposition of those projects, making them very fruitful to do in those states. That's why in the current mix of the PJM grid projects, you will find there were 30-some proposed projects in Pennsylvania. There were 2 in West Virginia this past cycle for the last Q. Both of those projects in West Virginia only got in because the local officials, in this case county commissioners, were willing to consider payment in lieu of tax agreements, which in essence allows for, to facilitate those, is a transfer, because our Constitution requires equal and fair taxation. Those projects require transfer of title to those projects to a governmental entity that under state code are provided an exemption from taxation. So when they go into the public entity's hands, those projects are taken off the tax rolls. Now the leasehold interest that's created between the governmental entity and the project developer creates a leasehold interest. Under West Virginia law, that leasehold interest can also be separately taxable if it can have a separately determinable assessment. And the test under that in West Virginia at this stage is actually based on whether or not it is a bargain lease, meaning that it's something for less than fair market value, or it's freely assignable. Or in the case of power plants, that has been used for the power plants that have been built in the state in the last few years, including the Longview coal-fired power plant in Mon County is also the beneficiary of a pilot. Without that, those projects would never have happened in West Virginia. They could have easily moved just a few miles across the border and gotten the favorable tax treatment of the other states, Ohio and Pennsylvania, for those projects without the need for a pilot. So what payment in lieu of tax agreements are doing are allowing us to be competitive right up front for some of these larger commercial industrial projects. Not just that it applies to power plants per se in the energy sector, but it also does apply to manufacturing. most of the, if not all of the announcements that you see out of the State Development Office over the last 15 to 20 years have all involved some form of pilot. When their site consultants do their analysis state by state, one of the capacities they do is they bring everything down to a net present value. What is the cost of doing business on a net present value? And that having those pilot payments are a way for us to actually get ourselves into the mix. And where we've been able to use them, and we use them very effectively, they have generated additional tax base and have generated a lot of jobs. So when you look at manufacturing plants, from Certainty wallboard plant in the Northern Panhandle, to the Procter & Gamble plant in the Eastern Panhandle, to Gestamp here in Kanawha County, all the beneficiaries of pilot payments that allow those projects to be located here, which created, in essence, hundreds, if not thousands of jobs that, in essence, are building the tax base by virtue of all else that they bring to the table. So it is a job creator. There is, as I know, there are opposition to pilots in certain areas of the state, and I understand the premise behind those, of how do we use those to lower the overall tax base by building the base larger. That would be wonderful, and I hope that we get there one day, and we're making strides in that direction. But right now, for these large commercial projects, without having a payment in lieu of tax structure on the board to help eliminate, in some cases, for certain periods of time, or to create a lower tax base. Now, those are not, in essence, they can be, but are not entire tax abatements. In essence, what they do is they then facilitate a negotiation between the county and the locals, between the private investors, the private companies, and the locals, the county commissions, assessors, to negotiate a payment in lieu of the tax. That's why it's a payment in lieu of tax. So instead of paying at 100%, if a tax bill would be X, it's X less something. So in almost all those cases, you'll find that they are paying something. In many cases, substantial payments. In many cases, millions of dollars a year in pilot payments actually go to those local levying bodies as payment in lieu of taxes to provide for the local services. So those companies are not getting a, quote, free ride. They are still contributing to fire fees. They're paying for police services. They're paying for water and sewage. They're still making those investments, and they're still paying taxes. They're just not paying it 100% if they would if the pilot was not in place. But without it, I would argue those pilot payments in the millions of dollars that are being paid now would not be being made. Those investments and taxes would be paid in adjoining or competing states. So they do play a fundamental role in that in the process of job creation and creating an environment in allowing us to compete with surrounding states, especially for those surrounding states that border the Ohio Valley and the northern part of the state. We've seen that as a very aggressive tool that's used there and in the Eastern Panhandle. So the combination of those projects and a combination of these tools is, again, as I say, from an investment standpoint, have allowed us to really make great strides in the last 10 to 15 years in building out sites for companies to look at and to locate in, to help build out the infrastructure needed to facilitate those large private investments. The study that the annual report from the Development Office this year, which I believe is probably disseminated to all of you, I'm sure you've all read, is probably 300 pages thick. There's a lot of detail in there, district by district. So it's very transparent. There's nothing being hid. It's out on the websites. It's all in those reports. You can call the Development Office and get the information. Matter of fact, it's actually published online. So it's all very transparent. People can see what it is. There's a very long, tenuous project of public hearings and approvals to put them in place and to annually review them for the public to see those. So it is an open process that has really facilitated the base of how we do economic development, from site selection, site development, for the last 10 to 15 years. And again, laying on top of that, the pilot project, again, I would say we would not see nearly the investment that we've seen from the economic development, industrial, commercial side without the use of those programs over the years. Pilots, on the flip side, again, I'll just go to this point, and this was a point that was brought up in the legislature this last year, not to dodge that issue, but it was proposed by the administration this past year to actually start calculating or considering pilot payments that are paid on the payment in lieu of tax agreements into the state school aid formula. Currently, they are not captured in the state school aid formula. So that component of those pilot payments that come into play are not part of that decision-making process, and then do some future, if you will, opportunity costs to the state from the budget perspective going forward, but not the base. Nothing erodes the base from that perspective. But I know that was rejected by the legislature this past session, which I know the locals feel was a very positive thing from their standpoint of how they were able to treat those dollars and allow them more flexibility in negotiating and making those projects happen at the local level. Economic development and the fair tax system truly go hand in hand at the state and local level. Without one and the other playing in those ball games and in those sandboxes, many of those projects would never come to reality. And these tools that you all and the state has afforded local counties and municipalities to play there have been a lead driver in assisting the state in making sure that those projects are located here and are thriving to a large extent. One thing I'll finish with, Mr. Chairman, and happy to take any questions at all, is that all of these have lifespans. So none of these go into in forever. Real estate TIF districts, sales tax districts now, previously the statute didn't. This legislature just in the last couple of years corrected that, have 30-year lifespans. They have to go away in 30 years. They cannot extend beyond that. They can be shorter if approved that way by the county or in essence imposed by the state, the development office. So they do go away, and once those projects that are incentivized are invested, this is a premise that I've always kept in economic development. Once somebody spends money and builds a building, they don't remove it. They can't pick that up and take that away. They can't take it to another state. So we're going to have it there. They may not be willing to stay in that building and pay property taxes on it, but somebody will. Under our system, somebody will reuse that facility, and there will be future taxes generated off that facility, regardless of what happens in their business. From that point, if we can incentivize investment, capital investment in projects, in capital projects in West Virginia, they will be there. When those districts go away, it may not be during your tenure of the next 20 to 30 years on many of these TIF districts, but when they go away, 100% of those taxes that are now out there, be that 10, 15, 20 years from now, those taxes will 100% go back to the local levying bodies as though the TIF districts never existed. They can't be reestablished and go back in time. So they will be 100% collected by the levying bodies, and at that point will be calculated in the state's local share formula calculations, and we'll see a direct impact at the state's budget once those start rolling off, those first districts coming through the mix. So long-term, tremendous benefit. We'll have a tremendous benefit both to local levying bodies and to the state budget in years to come. But for now, are really serving the base for our development of sites for development projects in West Virginia. With that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity today and happy to answer any questions now or at any point from individuals who may just want to contact.